Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Mira Cohen, and I'm the Vice President of Programs at the International Spy Museum here in Washington, D.C. We are really excited tonight to welcome you to our program commemorating the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Just want to give a special thanks to the Pritzker Military Foundation on behalf of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library. Without their support, this program would not have been possible. It's our pleasure tonight to welcome a trifecta of historical and teaching talent. We have Drs. Timothy Naftali and Andrew Hammond and Ms. Lucy Stern. Dr. Timothy Naftali is a clinical associate professor at NYU, where he also directs the public policy program. He has authored numerous books on intelligence and served as the inaugural director of the Nixon Presidential Library and Museum for the National Archives and Records Administration. He's also often found on television, where you may see him as a contributor for CNN. Dr. Naftali, a leading expert in the field, is one of the only living historians to have engaged in research in the archives of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. Naftali has a co-authored book with Alexander Fursenko on the Cuban Missile Crisis, One Hell of a Gamble. Remains the only book based on research in SVR materials and the Russian Presidential Archive. All teachers in attendance this evening will be automatically entered into a raffle to win a copy of this very book. Dr. Andrew Hammond serves as the International Spy Museum's historian and curator. He was formerly a Mellon Public Humanities Fellow at the 9/11 Memorial Museum and is currently also a Public Policy Fellow at the Wilson Center. Dr. Hammond hosts the hit podcast, Spycast, which can be found on Spotify, Apple, or anywhere you find podcasts. Ms. Lucy Stern, a former classroom teacher, is the Director of Youth Education for the International Spy Museum. She develops curriculum and programs for local, national, and international communities, and regularly teaches workshops for young people. This evening, our historians will discuss how to teach the Cuban Missile Crisis to students who are born after the fall of the Berlin Wall. They will also draw on contemporary connections and very relevant issues. Please feel free to write any of your questions into the question box at any time. And time permitting, our moderators, who you see on screen, will share your questions. During the second half of our program, Lucy's going to model how to teach the Cuban Missile Crisis from an intelligence perspective. She's been teaching about the crisis for over 10 years as part of a student workshop that is offered at SPY. Additionally, you're going to have all been sent a very special historical document set curated specifically for this program by our team here at SPY, Dr. Naftali, and the team at the Kennedy Presidential Library. So it is my profound pleasure to introduce Drs. Timothy Naftali, Andrew Hammond, and Lucy Stern.
Thank you, Mira, so much, and welcome everyone. I'm not gonna lie, I think I've been thinking about this moment since a year ago when I realized it was going to be the 60th anniversary this October. As Mira said, this is a topic that I find fascinating. I've already spoken to Andrew and Tim at length about this topic because I think it's a topic that all students should know about, especially with what is going on in today's world. So Tim and Andrew, I want to kick it off to you guys first. You all are the experts in the field. You all know way more than I do. And so Tim, let me ask you this first question of how do you teach this important period in history to students who don't even know what the Cold War was or is?
Well, first of all, thank you, Lucy and Amira, for inviting me, and it's great to be with Andrew today. This is a challenge, not simply for high school and middle school teachers, but of course it's a challenge for us who teach at universities. So there are a couple of concepts that I try to convey. First of all, the concept of surprise and what happens when governments are surprised. And that's very important for this story because there is surprise on both sides in the course of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Despite the fact that intelligence is going to play a very important role, the appearance of nuclear missiles on Cuba was a surprise development for the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. And for the Soviets, Kennedy's response to discovering these missiles would come to be a surprise because they had assumed that that Kennedy would accept the placement of missiles in Cuba. So this is a story of surprise, and teaching students about what you need to know not to be surprised, and why surprises can matter in history, I think is interesting. The other concept, of course, is nuclear danger, and that is to some extent difficult to convey because we're not just talking about a post-1989 generation, we're talking about a post-9/11 generation. And so for them, maybe the students will know something about North Korea and concerns about North Korean nukes, and maybe a little bit, I don't think so, about the concern regarding Iranian nukes. But I think the danger of a misstep by a leader that could lead to catastrophe, arguably the end of civilization as we know it, that's a very tough but important concept, I think, to explain to students. And the last one is the one that's the most fun, I think, which is spies and the secret world and secrecy and what happens when you get caught. And this is a story of the Soviets thinking they can get away with sneaking missiles all the way from the Crimea, because some of them boarded ships at Sebastopol, which is now, a war zone, or should be, all the way from the Crimea, the Black Sea, all the way to Cuba. And the Soviets thought they could get away with it, despite the fact that the Americans had these really cool spy planes called U-2s. And so it's the concept of keeping a secret. And then the Americans will discover that these missiles have been placed in Cuba, but they're going to keep a secret. They're going to keep that knowledge a secret from the Soviets for 7 days, 6 days, until they figure out what to do about it. So there's secrecy plays a role too. And I think those three elements are a way of connecting this far away, somewhat complex story to kids that, are just learning about power and governments and nation states.
Andrew, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the reasons that this is important, the ongoing relevance of this, is a confluence of several things. One of them is crossing the nuclear threshold, which we're not going to, we're not going to turn back time. That threshold has been crossed. The second one is the shrinking of time and space because of technological developments. So the medium-range ballistic missiles that were going to be on Cuba that could have stayed there, they could have reached Washington, I believe, in 15 minutes. So if you just think about that compared to, say, George Washington, the amount of time that a decision maker would have to make a decision is so compressed, and they're under so much pressure. I mean, who can make a good decision in 15 minutes? Very few people. If you're going to buy a house, it takes way longer to make that decision, and a lot less is at stake. And then I think the other one is because of this revolution, just the destructive capacity of nuclear weapons is just incredible. It's something that George Washington could, only have, imagined in his worst nightmare. So I think that for all of those reasons, it may seem like something that's back in the day, that's in the past, but this is a very real thing that we're still living with and we're going to continue to live with. So, history is not, doesn't repeat itself and all of those cliches, but we can only go on what's happened before because we can't see the future. So I think it pays to look at things like this to see what can go wrong. So Tim's example is a good one, a surprise that led to a surprise, and that's the way that nuclear miscalculation can quickly escalate, because no one can determine what variables are going to pop up when you influence one variable. So I think that that's one of the reasons for its ongoing relevance. And I think at the Spy Museum, one of the things that we try to do, the story's bigger than the intelligence story, but I think the intelligence story is an important part of it. So the former director of Central Intelligence, Richard Helms, who was the president under the director of Central Intelligence under Lyndon Baines Johnson and Richard Nixon, and Tim used to be at the Nixon Library. He was actually the head of operations basically for the CIA at the time. And he said that the Cuban Missile Crisis was really an intelligence crisis. The threat only appeared through intelligence sources, and it was only those sources that confirmed that the threat had gone away. So he maybe slightly overstates the case, but nevertheless, I think it is an important point. The intelligence is an important part of this story, because if you're in the most high stakes game of poker in history, where the time available to make a decision is extremely compressed, any shred of information you can have about the cards the other side is holding, their intentions, their psychology, how their previous playing style, I think, is important. So I think for a whole variety of reasons that this is important, and it's important for us as a species, and that's not going to go away.
Yeah, I'd like to add to something that Andrew said, which is that history's living, and it's worth keeping. It's worth taking note of the fact that Vladimir Putin was a middle schooler when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, and our president actually is 10 years older than Vladimir Putin, and so he is actually 20 years old, or roughly 20 years old, not quite, when the crisis happened. And this crisis is actually affecting both of them, their memories of this crisis. We can be sure that it's affecting Biden because Biden has referred to the Cuban Missile Crisis. He said that we're now the closest we've been to Armageddon since 1962, since this crisis. In terms of Putin, Putin is actually following some of the same strategies that Nikita Khrushchev, who was the head of the Soviet Union at the time, followed in the months and years before 1962. And I happen to know that books about the Cuban Missile Crisis are being published in Russia, and it is a subject that is of discussion in Russia currently. So both of the leaders, to some extent, are taking whatever lessons they've drawn from the history, and am I saying relying on it? No, but it is, at least on the margins, influencing the way they're handling the element of nuclear danger in the Ukraine war.
So go ahead, Andrew.
No, I was just going to very briefly follow up. I think that's another, to me, that's another important historical point. What actually happened is one part of the historical record, but what people thought happened is also part of the historical record. So, whether Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin's analysis of the Cuban Missile Crisis is correct or not, it's also important that they do have an analysis of it, and they are the people who, with their fingers, metaphorically on the button. So I think that that's important to remember too.
So I think I want to get into the intelligence point, because we are the Spy Museum after all. And I just want to let people know, I see the questions coming in. We will get to them. A lot of them are about Putin and Ukraine, understandably. But before I get to the questions, what do you both think? And I know I've talked to both of you about this. Are the 3 things that students need to get out of this from the intelligence angle, or are there 3, documents, or I don't know. I'm gonna let you guys take that and go with it.
Shall I?
Let's start with Tim.
I sort of moved first, but we both want to say, I'm sure. Look, this is a remarkable crisis to talk about, and there's a reason why we're both passionately interested in interjecting, because there's a lot to say, but our time is limited. So I want to focus on focus on a problem that John F. Kennedy had, and it's of the moment. John F. Kennedy needed more Democrats to be elected in the midterm elections of 1962. Even though the Democrats were leading in both the Senate and the House, the Democratic coalition was not a useful coalition for him legislatively, because Southern segregationist Democrats controlled a lot of power, and he needed more liberals in the North and the West and the Midwest to be elected. So he's really worried about the midterms, and the Republicans have jumped on the issue of Cuba because they're arguing that Kennedy is dropping the ball. He is not focused on the problem in Cuba, and the Soviets are about to build a missile base in Cuba. He sees this as a huge political problem, and he doesn't think the Soviets are going to put missiles in Cuba. He has his brother Bobby, who's maintained on his instructions a secret channel to the Soviets. He has Bobby go and check with the Soviets. The Soviets say, we're not going to do that. No way, we're not going to put missiles in Cuba. Are you kidding? So Kennedy is absolutely certain that if there's going to be a crisis, the crisis is going to be in Berlin. That's a whole different story, but just for the sake of, to try not to complicate this too much, just think of Kennedy as looking in another direction. He doesn't think Cuba's the problem. He thinks it's going to be some other place. If you're interested in a historical analogy, Barack Obama is not worried about ISIS. He is focused on other issues, and it sort of takes his eye off the ball when it comes to ISIS in Iraq and Syria. JFK is focused on a new crisis in Berlin. And he doesn't want a political crisis, and he doesn't want to look weak. And the Republicans are saying, one in particular, that there are going to be missiles in Cuba. So when he gets the word from Bobby Kennedy, his attorney general and brother, that the Soviets are not going to do it, he decides to draw a red line. He publicly says, we will not, I'm paraphrasing, we will not countenance, we will not permit, we will not accept offensive military systems on the island of Cuba. Now, he says that assuming the Soviets wouldn't do it. This is really important. Now, there are people around him who are not so sure, and so they want to deter the Soviets. They want to be tough. He doesn't think, no, he just thinks, I got to do this politically. It's all political. So he's already drawn this line. Now, the Soviets hear this and get scared. And they think, oh my God, he knows. He knows. Because the Soviets don't have great intelligence on American decision-making at all. But they at least can read the newspaper, and you can learn a lot from the American newspapers. So the Soviets up the ante. Americans don't know this, but they put more nuclear weapons in Cuba. They started to put them at the tactical level. Not just the ones that could hit the United States, which they never intended to use, but the tactical ones you would use in the event the Americans invade. Now, but Kennedy is trying to avoid a domestic political problem. So he's telling the intelligence community a couple of things that are ultimately going to make the crisis worse for him when it starts. The first thing he tells the intelligence community is, I want you to clamp down on raw intelligence that says that there are missiles in Cuba. I don't want it leaking. I want you not to disseminate it unless you can prove it with pictures. So suddenly the intelligence community stops sharing with itself. And more importantly, he didn't expect this to happen, but it happened with him, raw intelligence that comes in that points to the possibility that the Soviets are putting in offensive missiles. This is really important. The second thing he does is he worries about his spy planes. One crosses into Russian territory. Another one gets shot down over China. And he says, oh my God, I don't need an accident. Stop flying them. Don't fly them anymore. Well, he's been flying them over Cuba. And he says to the intelligence community, I don't want you to take a chance. When the intelligence community says to him, we found surface-to-air missiles. These are not the ones that you use to launch a missile against Washington, D.C. These are the missiles. They're conventional. They don't have nuclear warheads that you use to shoot down planes. And they're really good at shooting down spy planes. When he hears that, he says, no more flights over Cuba. So Kennedy does two things that are contradictory. One, he says, do not share intelligence, raw reporting from spies, unless you get pictures that prove it. And number two, don't get me pictures because the plane will be shot down. That's why we've shared with you these maps of where the plane flew, the spy planes flew. And you will notice that they stopped flying over Cuba. Okay, now these are the ones in August, and you notice that these fly over Cuba, right? And these are the ones that found the surface-to-air missiles. But watch what happens when in early September, these American planes get shot down one gets shot down over China and the other one crosses into Soviet airspace. The US doesn't want to fly anymore over Cuba because of the fear that the plane will be shot down, and this will give Republicans an issue in the midterm election. So American domestic politics is really important to understanding why Kennedy does a bunch of things that will make the crisis really, really big when it starts. One, he's going to put his prestige on the line that he's not going to let missiles go into Cuba. And two, he's going to make decisions that delays the moment when he learns about the missiles in Cuba. And what you have in the packet is first of all, you see that the US stops flying over Cuba in September. What you don't know is that it's on September 9th, the missiles start to appear actually on the island. So right when the missiles start to really appear, real missiles, the US isn't flying over Cuba. If we could look at the next one, please, Lucy. Now, back to this. Okay.
Tim, just for so teachers know, this was the packet that was sent out. It's the additional packet.
Oh, okay. Now,
so,
but I want, and then I promise to stop. But I want you to look at. I want you to look at this map, and you'll notice there is one black line that goes across Cuba. The other ones, look what they do. They skirt the island. But you'll notice that one crosses the island. That's intelligence. That is one of the great intelligence stories, American intelligence stories. Kennedy basically told the intelligence community, okay, you're allowed one. You're allowed to take a risk, one risk, because some intelligence had come in that he didn't see, but people in the Pentagon saw, people in the CIA saw, and there was a lot of pressure on Kennedy to change his policy about overflights. And he says, you got one. And so what you have in your packet is the evidence of why they chose this part of Cuba. And of course, guess what? That's the flight that would produce the first pictures of Soviet surface-to-surface missiles. The nuclear missiles are found because of this. And this flight happens in this way because of intelligence from spies the US has in Cuba. Let me tell you, it would be really cool in intelligence history if we had lots of these bullseyes. There may be quite a few that are, still secret, but I think we'd learn about most of them. This one is a bullseye. This is one of those rare instances where you have this combination of aerial intelligence, or photographic intelligence, and spies, human, as they call it, human intelligence, and they combine. The human intelligence gives the CIA a sense of where the plane should fly, and the Pentagon, because the CIA and the Pentagon are working together, where the plane should fly. They make the case to the president, and the president says, okay, we'll take a risk, but you get only one flight. You got to make it count. And boy, do they make it count.
Tim, I'm smiling ear to ear, and I don't know if Andrew knows why, but what Tim just described is exactly what we're going to do in the simulation. Is we are literally going to look at the intelligence that Kennedy and his analysts looked at CIA and at the Pentagon, in order to make that decision of, do you send a U-2 plane? So I'm just smiling. I'm like, oh, we did something right when we're teaching it. But Martin wants to know, what was the value of flying planes that did not fly over Cuba? Because we see a lot of these pass and they're not going over Cuba. So what was the reason for that?
Well, the ones that went, there was a sense that you could at least get some photos. And I think they also were picking up electronic information. I think they were also capable, because the CIA and the NSA, it's the National Security, the National Security Agency, which is the Electronic and Signals Intelligence Agency. They're the ones they're code breakers. They were interested in finding evidence of radars and picking up information about the radar systems that are associated with surface-to-air missiles. Because just because you can see a surface-to-air missile doesn't mean it's active, doesn't mean it's actually operational. And it was very important to know which ones were operational. So I believe there's a little of that they're picking up too. But it's a really remarkable story, because the only way to understand why the planes are not flying over Cuba at a time when there was an increasing amount of intelligence that pointed to the possibility of missiles in Cuba was this domestic problem that Kennedy had. He did not want a plane shot down. In a sense, he didn't want a crisis over Cuba during the midterm election.
Can I briefly jump in, Lucy?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so in a former life, I was in the Air Force Photographic Intelligence, and I think that when you're thinking about a U-2 spy plane up at twice the height of a commercial airliner with a wide-angle lens, you can still capture stuff even if you're not directly over Cuba. And Tim's right, the electronic intelligence, and planes can also bank and go side to side to capture imagery as well. So there's, you don't necessarily have to be exactly over the heart of Cuba to get imagery. And just to go back to your earlier point about a few things that you would stress for students, I think that Tim touched on two of them there, and I think that it would be that this is an all source intelligence effort. So by all source, it basically just means by any means. So just to take a step back, if you close your eyes and think about, as a human being, what you encounter on a day-to-day basis, it's phenomena all around you. You hear stuff, you see stuff, you smell stuff. There's stuff beyond the spectrum that human beings can pick up. Well, intelligence agencies are basically capturing that phenomena in quite targeted ways to try to build up a picture, some sense of coherence out of this kaleidoscope of information. So some of the ways that they do that is human intelligence, which Tim touched upon. So that's what people classically think of when they think of espionage or spying. It's the person on the ground getting information. There's signals intelligence and communications, which Tim referred to, which is capturing radio signals, cracking codes, and then there's photographic intelligence or imagery intelligence. So with regards to Cuba, we've got spy satellites, we've got U-2 flights, we've got lower level reconnaissance aircraft, which can pick up different types of phenomena. So, you know, in the packet there's some really interesting material, but basically a way to think about it is just they're trying to build up a picture, they're trying to cross-reference things, they're trying to triangulate information. They're just, you know, in a very imperfect information environment, they're just trying to build up a picture of what is there to try to help inform their decision making, which I think is, you know, this, as Tim said, history rarely throws up these amazing case studies, and I think this is one, and Tim's done intensive work on this particular one. So I just think it's particularly fascinating.
And I think just to add, Andrew, and to Tim, it's all been, well, what we know of is declassified, whereas a lot of these we think we know, but we probably don't know the whole story, or there's really bits and pieces that are important that we are missing. And rarely do we hear about an intelligence success of this magnitude. If it's a success, it usually goes quiet.
There's only policy successes and then
Yes.
intelligence failures.
Well, and it's worth, I think, emphasizing that what you're looking at here are materials that were declassified in 1992, only 30 years after the crisis. There was an interesting period just after the end of the Cold War when the U.S. intelligence community was thinking about its own future and was declassifying materials at a different rate, and a lot of operational materials, partly to make clear the value of intelligence, because there were many people who thought after the Cold War was over, why bother? I mean, we're done. In fact, in American history, intelligence services until World War II were not really considered normal parts of the U.S. government. You know, Andrew, I'm sure talks a lot about this at SPY, but you know what Americans would do is they would have this surge capacity where they'd start using spies when they were at war, and then they would dump the spy system after the war ended. That will change with World War II and what they learned from the British. But after the Cold War ended, there was some question as to, you know, do we really need this apparatus? And I wouldn't say that all these declassifications were motivated to make the argument, but they didn't hurt. And so you see in the early 90s, more material from the intelligence community coming out. And the Cuban Missile Crisis is a really, really great example of the value of intelligence. I think I was just wanted to mention one thing. Since you're teaching, I guess they're Gen Zs, maybe, I don't know what comes after Gen Z. They might not understand how complicated this was, because they live in a world where Google Earth will give them all the information they need if they want about a certain part of the world. One of the things you have to explain, I think, is how technology changes. You know, Andrew was talking about, you know, how time and space have changed. Well, technology has changed. In a sense, the student has more in her iPhone, more intelligence capabilities in her iPhone, arguably than the CIA had at the time. They don't have the crypto capabilities the NSA had at the time, but they've got the ability to get pictures of the world in a way that the US couldn't without taking huge risks. You could not attempt, no one would attempt this kind of surprise again. The Soviet surprise would not be possible like this. What's interesting is how governments have still tried to conceal. You know, deception hasn't ended, but they know that certain things are not going to be a surprise. Vladimir Putin knew that his movement of troops towards Ukraine and in Belarus wasn't going to be surprised. But what he had to keep a surprise was his intentions. But he knew that because of overhead reconnaissance, because of just Google Earth. You don't have to be a government anymore to know this. There are certain things that could be a surprise in 1962 that can't be anymore. So part of the story for these students is, hey, this actually can't happen in this way anymore. Kennedy had to take a huge risk to get pictures of something that you can get pictures of now with your own iPhone.
It's interesting. So one person asks, taking into consideration the present relationship between the United States and Cuba, what is to stop Putin today from putting missiles back in Cuba?
Well, he'd have to, it's a long way, you know, he'd have to move them on ships. They're still very long. You can't put them in a plane. You can move the warheads in a plane, but so you're going to have to put them on ships, and it's very hard to move those kinds of ships across the Atlantic without NATO seeing. And NATO has developed techniques. I mean, they developed them at the time. They were sort of old-timey techniques to figure out what was on ships. They would look at, I assume the U.S. government still does this, but in that era, they took photographs of all Soviet merchant ships, and they looked at how they sat in the water, and by how they sat in the water, they got a sense of how full they were, and then they studied the crates on top of the ships, and actually there was a term. Andrew's smiling, so I know he knows it. Cratology was the study of crates, and then because they had pictures that they had gotten from U-2s over the Soviet Union and from ultimately spy satellites of the crate and the thing in the crate. So they knew what kinds of planes went in certain crates, and they had these pictures of crates, and they say, oh, that crate, that's a crate for an Ilyushin 28, which was a bomber that could actually carry nuclear capable bombs. That sort of thing. So, well, if Putin tried to move big crates across the Atlantic, he'd get cut. Oh, there's one other thing. Nuclear warheads emit radiation, and in 1962 it was really tough for the CIA to know if nuclear warheads were moved. And one of the things they did, this is again old-fashioned kind of stuff. If any of you have seen, obviously not at the time, but have seen the movie From Russia with Love, and get a sense of the Turkey of that era, the Americans, maybe the Turks did it for the United States, but they had these boats that would come up to Soviet ships as they exited the Black Sea, because there's those narrows, the Bosphorus near Istanbul, and they would use frogmen to put Geiger counters next to the hulls of these ships to see if they emitted radiation. And if they emitted radiation, they were carrying warheads. Very imperfect. It didn't work, actually. I don't think there's that kind of problem anymore. Andrew would probably know better than me. I think we have a much better way of detecting the emission of radiation emissions so that we would be able to track warheads coming across the Atlantic. That's the reason I think it'd be much harder to do. In fact, probably impossible to do secretly these days.
Yeah, I think just to touch on Tim's point, I think it's the phenomena that I was describing that's out there. So you can't see radiation, but I think the ways to capture it out there in the universe are much more sophisticated now. So yeah, I think it would be a pretty difficult feat to pull off.
And by the way, Putin doesn't need to do it. The one reason, and the Kennedy administration debated this with itself, which was that the missiles in Cuba weren't necessarily a game changer. Yes, they cut the amount of time before a missile would hit the United States, because otherwise the Americans were, subject to intercontinental ballistic missiles sent from Russia. But in terms of the nuclear balance of terror, the United States was far ahead of the Soviets. But the reason Kennedy had to do something was he had drawn this red line and he had told the American people, I won't let this happen. And then the Russians did it. So there was a matter of American prestige that was really involved. And we have John Kennedy on tape. John Kennedy had this secret taping system. It's not secret anymore. But we have him on tape talking to his brother at an unguarded moment, saying to his brother, you know, I'd be impeached if I didn't do something about those missiles. I got to get rid of them. So this had become a political problem just as much as a strategic problem for Kennedy.
Can we talk a second about the missiles in Turkey? Because we're getting a couple questions about that, and I think it's important for students to realize. I think sometimes we forget, was Khrushchev's motivation to put the missiles in Cuba because our missiles in Turkey, you know, I don't know. What are your thoughts on?
Well, I'm a bit of an outlier on this. I wrote 2 books with Alexander Fershenko using Russian materials on this period. And in the first book, One Hell of a Gamble, I wasn't sure. I read Russian and Alexander couldn't write in English. And so he brought me the materials and in Russian, the raw materials, and then we discussed it, but I wrote the book. So I love Agatha Christie. And in the first book, One Hell of a Gamble, I said it's sort of like, I'm sorry if I'm ruining it for somebody who's never seen Murder on the Orient Express, but that everybody did it. That in fact, there are a whole bunch of reasons that would have motivated Khrushchev to do this. It's not I'm sure for many people, it's not the most satisfying explanation, but we had come across a number of different motives. Well, when I wrote the second book with Alexander, we got some very interesting high-level material from the Russian, we would call it Politburo now, but Presidium is what they called it then. But it's the decision-making group of the Communist Party led by Khrushchev. And it became clear that Khrushchev had this bizarre and very dangerous notion of containing the United States by scaring the United States. And it wasn't working. And the US was defending its positions in Southeast Asia in a way that Khrushchev didn't think was going to be possible. And he got really angry. And so he decides to put missiles in Cuba to scare the heck out of the United States, to contain American power. Not so much to defend Cuba, because the Soviets had already put together a package to defend Cuba, and it was a conventional package. It did not involve nukes. But it was a general feeling of strategic inferiority to the Americans. And Khrushchev was a very impulsive guy. And once he got excited and thought, it's going to work, I mean, it's such a cockamamie scheme. The more you learn about it, you realize, I don't know if some of you ever played the game or whether your parents ever played the game Mousetrap. This follows that, which follows that, which follows. This was a cockamamie scheme. But Khrushchev really thinks it's going to work. And he begins to think about what he can do with this power. And he wants to reorganize NATO's position in Europe. He wants to get them out of West Berlin. There are all kinds of things he wants to do. Yes, the missiles in Turkey bothered him, but think of the missiles in Turkey, they are NATO missiles or US missiles, as another example of the strategic inferiority of the Soviets. Basically, the Soviets felt they couldn't do what they believed they wanted to do. Khrushchev was very ambitious about spreading Soviet power. He did not want to go to war. He did not want to spread power militarily. He wanted to do so economically and ideologically, but he felt that American power made that impossible. So I see his decision to put missiles in Cuba as a product of his deep strategic frustration. And he's a very impulsive guy. And he thought, aha, this is how I'm going to do it. Now, I don't know if I'm right, but I will say that Sergei Khrushchev, Khrushchev's son, who knew a lot about his father, a lot more than I do, told me he really liked our book, Khrushchev's Cold War. So I'm not saying that we got it, but my feeling is that given the nature of the materials that became available in the early 2000s, we got this sort of generalized sense of insecurity by Khrushchev. The Turkish missiles matter, but they're not like the thing that pushed him over the edge. There are a number of sources of insecurity and fear for him in early 62. What do you think, Andrew?
Yeah, I think that, yeah, I don't think there's much I could really add to that that you haven't touched on. I think that, you know, if you think, I also think that part of it is that he thought Kennedy was going to be a little bit more of a pushover than he actually was, which emboldened him. And then, of course, because Kennedy came out and said, we won't tolerate this, then he was locked into doing something about it. So one of the questions I noted touches on the impact of rhetoric, which could easily be a whole like other session in and of itself. The way that rhetoric can shape and constrain outcomes and world politics. But if you don't mind, Lucy, I want to have a go at a question that I see from Gabriel, who I think is a student from Horizon Middle School. And he's
Please
saying,
do, Andrew.
He said, what would the consequences have been if the USSR had decided to launch? Would the damage have been global? I mean, I think one way to think about this, so there were much more, it depends on the period of the Cold War, but there were much more nuclear weapons kicking around during the Cold War than there are now. But let's just look at, say, the island that I originally come from, so the island of Britain. So we're talking about Scotland, England, and Wales. Guess where I'm from. But a small island in the northwest of Europe. I believe it fits inside Oregon, so in the United States. And 100 nuclear weapons that landed on the 100 biggest cities on that island of Britain would have killed around 90% of the population, I believe. And the other 10% would probably have wished that they were part of the 90%. So we're talking about a much smaller landmass than the United States, of course, but that just gives you an extent of the, you know, that was 100 of those missiles was an infinitesimal fraction of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. So I think we're talking about, you know, we're talking about some very serious things. And there's a lot of debates among scientists and things that are, you know, not really, I don't have the expertise to get involved in surrounding nuclear winter and the effects it would have on the climate and the Great Ocean conveyor belt and so forth. But I mean, whatever way it shakes out, it's not going to be good for human beings more generally.
Gabriel, there is one of the documents, great question, by the way, one of the documents that Lucy has made available is a memorandum of a meeting on October 21st. I'm pointing you in that direction because the president asked the same question that you just did. Because the president didn't know what to do. John Kennedy's first reaction to being betrayed was that he wanted to use force to get rid of the missiles. So, so John Kennedy the president has made up his mind. His advisors have been talking for a week, and most of his advisors are beginning to move in the direction of giving Khrushchev time, basically wagging a finger at Khrushchev and saying, no more, establish a blockade, so prevent more missiles from coming to the island. But as for the missiles that are already on the island, which the US knows there are missiles on the island, those you're gonna tell Khrushchev you've got to remove them. And if you look at this document, the president has not made up his mind yet that he's not going to use force. He's asking a general of the Air Force, basically, if I approve an airstrike on all the missiles that we have located so far, are all of them going to get taken out? Because the fear is you launch an airstrike and then the ones you don't hit, the Soviets are going to launch. And then it gets to the question that you asked, which is what happens? What happens if they launch them? And you'll see in point 4 here, Secretary McNamara is the head of the Pentagon. He's the Secretary of Defense. And General Taylor, he's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Those are the military leaders of each of the armed services. They told the president an airstrike could not provide absolute assurance that all missiles were destroyed. They indicated a 90% probability. Now, I want you to think about being president of the United States. Maybe you want to be. I'm not sure this would make you want to be. And somebody says to you, your experts tell you, Mr. President, we can launch an airstrike and we can destroy probably 90% of the missiles. Not 100%, 90%. So the decision, if you decide to go with an airstrike, you're taking a risk that the 10% that are left, which I haven't looked at this in a while, but let's say the 3 or 4 missiles, that they will be launched. Can you take that risk? Can the president of the United States take a risk that 3 nuclear warheads bigger than Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that's where the United States used nuclear weapons at the end of World War II, bigger than those? So imagine New York or Atlanta, probably Atlanta and Washington, D.C. get hit with nuclear weapons. Can you take that risk as president of the United States? And for that president, even a 10% chance was 10% too much. He wouldn't do it. He just wouldn't do it. So he thought exactly the way you were thinking. And he said, I can't do that. And so he didn't. And so this is the last minute. He hadn't really made up his mind yet. This is it. This is the meeting that does it for Kennedy. When he figures out that there's no way that they can actually get rid of the missiles that they've detected, let alone the ones they haven't detected. So the question you asked, Gabriel, is the question John F. Kennedy was asking. And it's the question that led John F. Kennedy to decide to give Khrushchev a chance to back down.
Go ahead, Andrew, sorry.
Yeah, just really quickly, I think that one of the problems is that there isn't a huge variety of test cases that we can look at for nuclear war. So the problem is, where does it stop? Because remember, if they try to take out all of the missiles, and to go to Tim's point, let's just say three of them are launched. Remember, this is not Cuba that's launching them. This is the Soviet Union that's launching them against the United States. So what's the response to that? And then what's their response to what the United States does? And you can see how this can quickly escalate out of control and be, much broader than the island of Cuba.
Yeah. You both are making excellent points, and I'm almost at the point of, why don't we model sort of putting the teachers into the shoes, and therefore their students into the shoes of CIA analysts. And Tim and Andrew, I both prepped you before, and to the audience, I've told them to interrupt me at any point if I say something wrong, or if you want to expand on it. But if I've kept my video on, partly just to make sure I can help moderate, but also, if you've seen my reaction, I've been smiling the entire time that Tim and Andrew have spoken, partly because every document they have talked about, we use in our simulation. And the questions that they asked tonight are the questions we ask students. And I think that's important. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take over. And then Andrew and Tim, if you guys want to take a look at the Q&A, and if you all want to respond to questions in the chat while I'm talking as well, feel free to. But to give you a little bit of background, and what we've already sort of talked about today, is the Spy Museum 10, 12 years ago decided to create this simulation, in part because there's so much that has been declassified. And in the world of intelligence, rarely do you get that. And what I love about teaching this topic, I don't love the subject. The thought of nuclear war scares me, but I love it because it's tangible, and this topic is something that all students can relate to. And I think it's important for students to understand this, especially in today's world. And not only is it primary documents, which is, I know, such a huge focus when we talk about history and social studies, but it's tangible documents. I love intelligence documents because they're straight, there's to the point, there's no fluff involved. And so for students, they can easily understand, for the most part, what is being said. Okay. And so we're going to take a look at this. I'm going to run through this very quickly, but please ask questions. And I'm also at various points going to have my team open the chat in this webinar, because I want feedback. I want you all to be engaged. I think that's one of the pros of virtual learning, in a way, is the chat. It can be a blessing or a curse. So please be kind, please be nice. Please don't say anything negative or angry or controversial. But I always like to set the stage with students. I feel like it's so important for them to feel like they are back in that time. So we ask them to take their cell phones out. We throw them away, in a way. We want them to be present, but also, as Tim and Andrew both mentioned, there were no cell phones back there. There was no internet back in October of 1962. So we're going to start in October of 1962. And I love music, I love sports, I love TV. So I like to get the students to understand what life was like. So we start with playing Sherry by Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons, because that was the top TV song, or top song, back on October 10th. Now, the weekend after, it was the Monster Mash, but let's see. I don't know if you guys can hear this. I like to sing, and now it's going to be stuck in your head the rest of the night. I'm sorry. But the Andy Williams Show was the most popular TV show back in the day. You also had Space War, which was one of the top video games, and one of the first video games ever created. And because I'm a huge sports fan, and it is the World Series right now, the Yankees are beating the Giants in the World Series. But that's what's going on. And what really is going on in the world is the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so for students, we sort of take that step back and we put them into the shoes of all source analysts at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Okay, so this is not a retro photo of Langley, but everyone in their packet, the first packet that was sent out, has a pseudo job description of what an all source analyst does. This was not provided by CIA. This is a spy museum document. Please don't go around saying that this is exactly what a CIA analyst does, but it's a summary. And what I love is for the students to take on this role. It gives them a little bit of ownership and acting, which I find fascinating. You know, some kids, they need a little bit of acting. So they become all source analysts, and they're looking at all different types of intelligence coming in, whether it be those human sources, human intelligence, whether it's photo intelligence or photant, okay? So that is their job. And so we also provide them with a little bit of background before we delve into this heavy topic. We talk about the four key players. I think it's very important that students know who John McCone is. He is the director of Central Intelligence at the time. He is our boss. We report to him. You can sort of pretend I'm John McCone today. But then he reports to President Kennedy. All right. And most students know who Kennedy is, but not a lot. So we make sure we cover that. And also for international students, they might not know who Kennedy is. We also talk about Khrushchev and Castro, but then we move on to this image. You all have this image. It was provided by the John F. Kennedy Library in their curated document package. And this shows the missile range. And I know Tim mentioned it earlier, Andrew mentioned it earlier. I always like to have students, if they're from the US, highlight where they are from. Yes, if they have medium range ballistic missiles, anywhere in that middle circle could be hit with nuclear fire, all right, including Washington, DC, okay? That puts it into perspective, at least for me, being in Washington, DC. If I have students from Seattle, I say they're outside that intermediate range rocket range. However, as we already discussed, nuclear war would have serious consequences, not just in that circle. Okay, so it's important for students to know the severity of this crisis. Okay, I also think it's important that they know what we're looking for. This is what a medium range ballistic missile looks like in the Red Square in Moscow, Soviet Union. It is about 73.5 feet long with the nuclear warhead attached. Okay, it's a long missile. And I always tell students, let's say you're driving down a road and you see a missile on the Beltway, which is the DC's main highway, you would notice it. All right, so if the Soviets have placed these missiles in Cuba, it's hard to believe that Cubans wouldn't notice it. Okay, now what we're about to do is we're going to do a little bit of the intelligence cycle. And I was talking to Andrew and I was talking to my colleagues earlier, and we think it's important that everyone knows the intelligence cycle for the most part. And so just so you all are aware, you start with a question, and that comes from the policymakers. So what is the information? What do we need to know? Then it goes to how are we going to collect this information? So whether that's from a human source, whether it's from a YouTube photo, whether it's from signals intelligence, okay? So once we have that information, we then rely on people to figure out, is it in a foreign language? If so, then we have to translate it. Is it in code? Do we have to decode the message? Okay. Then we got to make sense of it. And that's where the analyst job comes in. They're putting the pieces of the puzzle together. They're making a picture. They're trying to answer that question to then send to the policymakers. And then guess what? Those policymakers, they're going to send that question right back. They're going to ask another question, a follow-up question. And so that is how we model our workshop, is on the intelligence cycle. We're going to ask a question. Is there enough intelligence to send a U-2 over Cuba? Okay. And so we provide students with 5 documents, that some of which Tim and Andrew both mentioned earlier, which had me smiling ear to ear. Some maybe are rogue. Maybe we included them because we just thought we wanted students maybe to go around a different path. But by having the students look at the real declassified documents and the redactions, and Tim, Andrew, you're going to laugh at me, but the amount of students who will literally go like this up to the light with a redacted document to see if they can figure it out, I still get a chuckle from. But so this is always the first intelligence question we ask. All right, it's October 10th. Kennedy needs to know, do we send a U-2? Why or why not? And so we pose that questions to the students. Do you trust the source? Why or why not? Can we corroborate it with what other students are reading in their documents? Are they getting the same information? Are they getting different information? If we send a U-2, what are the consequences? What are the pros? These are all questions that you can facilitate with your students, but you're also looking at the declassified documents. So we have a memorandum. I'm just showing 2 quick documents. These are some of my favorites from August 20th. And the memorandum sort of highlights sort of what's going on in Cuba. And keep in mind, when Kennedy and his administration asks Khrushchev ahead of time, like, what's going on? Something fishy is happening. Khrushchev and his team are saying it's just a defensive buildup in case you all try and invade Cuba again. Since we all know 1961, Bay of Pigs operation. Okay, so this memorandum I always find fascinating, and especially for English language learners or individuals who might have a harder time reading a document, especially in the small print. I love this document because it's bullet by bullet by bullet, even though it's in paragraph format. But it says 21 ships have docked since July. It's a lot of ships onto a small island. 4,000 to 6,000 Soviet troops. These aren't women and children. These are military coming onto a small island. Okay. And they're unloading these ships, and they're keeping the Cuban population out. It's a little puzzling, and students usually pick up on this. This is something they understand. It's not, scientific equations. This is true intelligence that has come in. All right. So they take that information. Then let's look at one more. And I don't know about you, Tim, but this might be one of my favorite documents. And I don't really know why, but I think it's a personal pilot of Fidel Castro. Okay. And I love talking to students about this because I think it goes to the point of, do you trust a source? Why or why not? And in this case, with the personal pilot of Fidel Castro saying that the Soviets had placed 40-mile range guided missiles, both surface to surface, the defensive missiles, and surface to air, that provides some context. That's another person saying something, but he's also the personal pilot of Fidel Castro. And so I always have students, we'll have arguments. Those students will go against each other. Do we, why would you trust this? Oh, maybe he wants to switch sides. Motivation comes into play, but it really gets the idea of we haven't vetted these sources, but we're going to take it with a grain of salt and sort of put it in the back of our head and see if we can corroborate it with other pieces. So this is just one example of how we use role playing and real primary documents to sort of explain the intelligence cycle and explain this question of, is there enough intelligence to send a U-2 plane, which I know Tim already talked about earlier, and he got one shot because Kennedy does decide to send a U-2 on October 14th. Okay, first thing in the morning, 7:30 a.m., flies over, all right, and gets those photos. Now, before we actually look at the photos, Tim or Andrew, I just spilled a lot. Anything you would like to add? Anything I messed up or what you want to elaborate on?
No, you set it up really well.
Perfect. So usually most students come to this consensus that we need to send a U-2, that there's really no other way to get the information, that we need to send a U-2 to figure out, what is going on. Okay. But then there's some that say it's not worth the risk of it being shot down. The pilot's life could be in danger. If that happens, it is shot down. What are the consequences? All that. So it's a great ethical conversation as well that you can have with students. You can even have them write a paper. I can't believe I'm saying that as a student who hated to write papers. But for the reasoning, why or why not? But ultimately, it is not up to us to make this decision. It goes back to that policymaker, therefore Kennedy. And so Kennedy sends you to. All right.
Lucy, can I suggest one thing?
Absolutely.
Just one other element that you can raise with a student besides the issue of the life of the pilot and the political risk, is that when you send a spy plane over another country, you're violating their sovereignty. And students care about their own personal sovereignty and their own privacy. And when should countries violate the sovereignty of other countries? Because that's also part of the issue here.
It is.
The reason that the reason why the Soviet missiles would shoot down the planes, well, partly it's now to protect their secret, but it's also because the planes are violating Cuban sovereignty. So that's another issue. When is it right for an American president to violate the sovereignty of another country?
It's funny, I forgot that, but we usually say that as well. And students don't usually think about that at first. And I think it's important, especially today with what's going on and going into foreign airspace and things like that. So thank you for mentioning that, Tim. All right, we're getting to that question. We're now circled back to Kennedy has that photo. He has those photos. And there's a fun tidbit. This is me sort of geeking out for a second, but Kennedy isn't briefed on the photos until the morning of the 16th. He left early. He was sick. So he left in a campaign event early. They all hid it. So this still isn't revealed to the public. But as analysts, you all know. So the U-2, the first U-2 plane flies on October 15th. It gets over 900 photos to look at. Now, U-2 planes at the time were classified top secret as our best spy plane. It flew at 70,000 feet. So you couldn't see it, couldn't hear it. Okay. But as Tim mentioned, it could be detected by a radar. So that was our anxiety making moment. But it comes back and the photos are clear. And it's sort of like an, oh my gosh moment. Everything we thought, we now have proof exists. I don't tell the students that, but you all know. So we're going to look at these photos. So we're going to pretend, because they also like to role play, give them that atmosphere, that we're at the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Suitland, Maryland, or NPIC. I'm still waiting for a light table. I would love to really look at these documents on a light table. I think it'd be fascinating. Also, students have no idea what a light table is today. So to show them that, and also like not being able to zoom in, I think I'd love to see that. But for the sake of this activity, we don't have a light table. I got a PowerPoint slide. So usually in our simulation, we divide kids up into teams. We have an alpha team, we have a Bravo team, we have a Charlie team, and they're all looking for different elements, and they're all looking at various U2 photos, reference photos, and even the low-level Navy planes that Kennedy sends later, because he needs even better, clearer photos. But so you could divide your students up into teams and look at these U2 photos and have them look for things, which I think is a great exercise for also collaboration and talking, and selecting a spokesperson who is then going to present the findings to the class. But in this case, some of the things you might be looking for: can you find the actual missile? Can you find the trailers? When we divide it up into teams, we sort of give them a key. And what I always try and remind students is, while they might have a key with what to look for, the analysts back then, they didn't. They sort of made assumptions. They sort of knew what they were looking for. They had reference photos, but they didn't have it written out of like a checklist of, oh, I see this, I see this. All right, so I think that's always an important thing for students to realize. I'm also still waiting for the unanalyzed photos, the U2 photos, because everything has the written what they are, and I want students to guess that. So I've had to sort of do my own redaction. And I recommend using a Sharpie if you need to do that for yourself. But so this photo, for example, I use this to trick students, because when we do this in the workshop, we give them a list of things to find. And students start to think, oh, well, I see this, I see that. Oh, that must be a tent area. Oh, that's a launcher, that's an erector. And yet there was nothing in this photo that they were supposed to find. And so I like to play a little bit of a confirmation bias trick on them, to say, just because you think, you've been told something's there doesn't mean it's actually there. But this is actually an intermediate range ballistic missile site. And I believe this is document 12 in your packet. And so, as you can see, they're all analyzed, which is fantastic if you're looking at them. But if you're wanting your students to do the activity, sort of black it out. I sort of separate conversation, but Tim, I'd love your thought, and Andrew as well. I have heard that after that first U2 plane flew over in October, the flights that came after, they usually followed the roads inland because they were pretty straight, and they would then just see the missile sites that way. They didn't have to do much flying over, they just had to follow the road. Had you heard that, or am I making that up?
I hadn't.
Okay.
I know where to no, but I mean, a main player, not the only player, but a major player, was a man named Dino Brugioni, and he wrote a memoir called Eyeball to Eyeball, and maybe he mentioned that. NPIC, this is one of the great moments for the photographic intelligence in American history, and they obviously had a lot of pride. I wanted to mention one thing. We were talking about all source intelligence, and because there wasn't an alpha guide like the one Lucy put together, I want you to think about how hard this was. The President of the United States had been involved in a debate for at least 6 weeks about whether the Soviets would put missiles in Cuba. And he was pretty certain they wouldn't. And the CIA itself had written an estimate saying the Soviets would not put missiles in Cuba. They said, look, the Soviets have never done this before. They're not going to do it now. So you had an opposite bias about this. But on the 16th of October, the president is going to be told there are missiles in Cuba, which is going to flip what the government thinks. It's very hard to change the mind of government, you know, very hard to change the minds of, especially of presidents or leaders. Okay, so why were they so confident? Why were they? And you can hear this on the tapes, by the way. If you want proof, if you want evidence of this, just go and look at the transcripts of the tapes that we did at the Miller Center. You can hear the CIA experts say, Mr. President, we are quite convinced that this is this. Part of the reason they were so confident was because of material they got from a spy named Oleg Penkovsky, which you probably will get to.
Don't ruin my thunder, Tim.
Oh,
that's I know I was gonna. I didn't get to mute you.
I apologize. I should go away. I should stop this. I'm sorry. I was just waiting. Patiently for the all source part.
No,
okay. I'm going to stop.
Yeah, we're gonna rewind.
Brian, I didn't say what I just said.
Yeah,
I have violated the need to know process. Sorry.
We never heard about him.
I'm going to go back to mute. I'm now muting.
I know I wasn't hitting the mute enough fast enough, but there was no spy on the inside. Wink, wink. I don't know about either you or Andrew or Tim or Andrew, but this is a photo that I think almost everyone has seen in my generation and earlier, probably not the students today, but I think it's such an important photo because this is a U-2 photo and clear as day, you see all the supporting equipment for a medium range ballistic missile. And so I love having students really analyze this one because I think they tangibly see things, unlike some other U-2 photos where you're like, I think that's something. And I also, Tim, I was smiling when you brought up cratology because we have a whole group of students in our simulation look at crates coming off of Soviet ships as cratologists. It was a term that was created during the crisis. And I have so many students laugh at me when I say, you all are going to be cratologists. They're like, what? But again, you're putting them in that role. You're giving them a job. And it's the topic of spying, which is the hook. And so I love looking at this photo because there's also a photo of another photo, and I believe we added it. This is document 16, and they actually the analysts cut a scaled model of a Komar guided missile, which is a defensive missile boat that shoots torpedoes, and they cut it so that would fit that size on the crate to make sure that probably what was inside the crate. So I find that whole part fascinating as well. So this is what it looks like when it's deployed, because whenever you have to have an offensive buildup, you also have to have a defensive buildup. You have to be prepared for retaliation. So I laughed when you said cratologist, got me very excited. So there's other ships coming off of Soviet or coming into Cuba that have the IL-20 fuselages and other things. But this is also a low level photo. This is always like music to my eyes because I feel like I can see clear as day what is going on. And my colleagues and I always get a chuckle when the amount of students are like, it's snow on the ground. And I just laugh and correct them and make them think for a second that does not snow in Florida, so it doesn't snow in Cuba. But I love this photo as well because you see the shelter tent and you see the trailers that are all there present day or, clear as day. So I think that's another moment that analysts felt. Andrew, you want to talk?
Yeah, can I jump in for a second?
Yeah.
Just on the topic of photographic intelligence, this is a really famous moment as well when the US ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson, goes before the UN with a gotcha moment. And then just to bring it more recently up to date, you see something similar just before the Iraq war, but
yes,
this time it's based on something that has got much less firm foundations, but that's a completely separate issue. And one thing I was just thinking when Tim was talking, so the Miller Center has got some amazing resources. Tim used to be there. It's fantastic. Another good place for teachers to go to and their students is the American Presidency Project.
Oh, right.
If you go to just Google it, American Presidency Project, it's got every presidential speech, proclamation, announcement going back to George Washington in 1789. And one thing I would encourage you to do, just to put this in context, do a search of John F. Kennedy's presidency and put in the 13 days, or the 13 days that most people speak about when they speak about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because what's quite interesting, to go back to something Tim was speaking about, was regular politics is still going on during all of this. It's like Kennedy is, in one speech, he's talking about opening I think it's a municipal airport. And then there's another one where he's saying to the country, you know, if there's a nuclear war, it will be ashes in our mouth, even if we win it, but we won't shrink from it if that's what it takes. And then I think it's literally 2 days later, it's the Pacific Tuna Association or something. And you know, it's really mundane mixed in with like really high stakes foreign policy. So it's just really fascinating to think about being president with all of these different things going on. And for those 7 days that you were saying that the news wasn't out, you're having to be an actor and pretend like everything's okay when you're talking to the Pacific Tuna, you know, Association. So I just think that that's quite an interesting like point.
It is, and thank you, Andrew, for bringing that up as well, because I think every historian, including in Tim's book and others, say Kennedy kept his regular schedule. He did not want to alarm the American public until it was absolutely necessary. And we're going to get to his speech on October 22nd shortly, but we're not there yet either. I know you're good. You guys are both good. I'm just slowly building up. I'm building the suspense. So now that we've looked at the photos, all right, as students, we're going to sort of every day since then, October 14th, Kennedy continues to send U-2s. He sends low-level planes. But then, if my thing will work, a little bit of animation, that's always slow, Kennedy comes back to us. And this is that third intelligence question. So we are doing a third cycle now of, so we know that missiles are in Cuba, okay? The offensive missiles. So are the sites operational? And if so, how long from command, which is going to come from the Soviet Union, to Russia, or from the Soviet Union to Cuba? How long is that going to take? And I love posing this question to students because they're like, oh, you just hit the red button, or just 10 minutes, like you'll know when the missiles are erect, that they're ready to launch. I always laugh because we don't know. And their students are completely guessing. And they're looking at popular culture to tell us what these missiles would do. And if you're the president of the United States, you wouldn't want your students telling you, just based on movies, how to launch a missile. But this is where we ask, do we know this information? We try and get them to say no, and we don't. And then where can we get this information? And this is where, Tim, if you want to unmute and tell us who we have on the inside in the Soviet Union, I'll let you sort of tell everyone. Who's our spy on the inside?
The United States and Britain are running an agent known as Oleg Penkovsky. He is a Russian or Soviet military intelligence officer. He is in an organization called the GRU. We have heard about the GRU most recently because in 2016, the GRU was overseeing the information operations during our election that Putin was running. Penkovsky has provided the United States and Great Britain with the manuals of the medium-range ballistic missiles. which include not only a description of their capabilities and specifications, but also an explanation of how they're deployed. And it's with the information of how they're deployed, which allows photo intelligence analysts to look for the pattern of deployment, which I believe can be described as a star.
Sure.
So it's giving, in other words, it's inside information that allows you to look in the right place and for the right configuration. Remember, it's really hard in this era because until they do the low level, and they only start doing low level flying once the crisis starts, from 60,000 feet or 70,000 feet, it's very hard to get very clear pictures. And so it's going to be fuzzy. So you got to know what you're looking for. And those manuals help give the photo analyst confidence that they know what they're actually seeing. And that's the confidence that they carry into the Oval Office and persuades Kennedy.
And I also think, adding on to it, Tim said, it gives the United States the upper hand, and we know how their missiles operate, but the Soviets don't know that we know, if that makes sense. I was trying to talk to Andrew about that yesterday. I was like, I think I'm going to confuse myself. But I always think that's an interesting thing. And it allowed Kennedy to sort of take a step back and think strategically too, because he knew, based on the information from the U-2, from Oleg, from other areas, that he had about at least 3 days before the sites were operational as of the 21st, partly because the nuclear warheads hadn't been visually seen. And so based on this intelligence, and I love talking about Oleg because I think it's that students might know a lot about the crisis, but it's that one piece that not many students usually know about, even though a movie just came out about it, The Courier. Anyway, there's also on YouTube, there's a whole, I'm blanking on the word, Andrew, a whole lecture, or when we did The Courier.
TED Talk.
I know.
Yeah, we have a program on it, and there was also a podcast on it, a Spy Museum podcast. Just super briefly, Lucy, because I know we don't have a lot of time, but just to build on Tim's point, not all sources are created equal. If you've got someone like Penkovsky, that can be better than having 50 sources that are much further down the food chain. So we don't have a lot of time to discuss that, but there's a qualitative part to sources, not just a quantitative part.
And I think that's excellent. And for many, they view him as the spy who saved the world. There's even a book called The Spy Who Saved the World about it. It's interesting. Historians disagree. We could have a whole conversation another time about Oleg. But because technically we only have 3 minutes left, I want to quickly just sort of wrap it up with, we have this information, and then I do usually show the Kennedy's speech on October 22nd, sort of announcing to the world what is going on. And then if we have time, I usually have students sort of, what are some options? We, throw out ideas. Okay, what could Kennedy do? Could he invade first? Could he put in a quarantine? Could he negotiate? What are the options? And then, of course, we know what happens. An agreement is reached, negotiations happen. I love all the letters that are written between Castro, Khrushchev, and Kennedy. I think that is a whole nother lesson that could be taught, and just looking also at diplomacy. But for the sake of time, we then talk about the quarantine, we talk about the agreement, and we talk about how they were able to triangulate, the students themselves were able to triangulate all various information to prevent something bad from happening. And that is why I love this topic, because I think students get to see full picture of the intelligence cycle, but also how intelligence played a major role in that. And with that, well done. And I know I hate showing that last slide, but we have 1 minute left. Andrew or Tim, I haven't been watching the Q&A. Was there one question that
could I think we mentioned at the beginning, maybe drawing some contemporary analysis. So, you know, I think we should take advantage of Tim because he's on TV quite often, putting the current headlines into context by relating them to the historic record. So I think we should hand it over to Tim since we're running out of time.
Well, thank you, Andrew. There are some good questions. I will say that having read quite a few Soviet documents from that period, I was struck by how reluctant Soviet analysts were to take a tough position. US analysts ultimately came to the President of the United States and told the President, what you didn't think was happening or going to happen has happened. Whereas Khrushchev's analysts did not warn him that it was likely that U-2s would spot the missiles. The Cubans actually thought that this plan might not work and asked Khrushchev, what will you do if the Americans actually spot the missiles before the deployment is finished? And Khrushchev said, don't worry. Kennedy will accept it. Or don't worry. My people tell me that the Americans won't spot these missiles. So I found in the Russian intelligence system an unwillingness to debate the assumptions of the leadership. And I think there's a good reason to believe that that kind of culture exists again in the Kremlin. And that one reason why Putin was able to mount this very ill-considered offensive with an army that couldn't do it was the unwillingness of intelligence analysts and military advisors around him to tell him the truth. Much as in Khrushchev's case, nobody wanted to take him on. It was Khrushchev's idea to put missiles in Cuba, and it was a bad idea. And so I see a similarity there. The second thing I would say about this crisis that is really useful today is that the threat of the use of nuclear weapons is not the use of strategic weapons. It is highly, highly, highly unlikely that the Russians would do anything that might result in a strategic exchange. Just as Andrew said, you know, 3 missiles get through, then you respond, then they respond. It's just highly unlikely, no matter how badly things go in Ukraine, that Moscow is going to risk an American nuclear attack on Moscow. But Khrushchev did consider briefly using battlefield or tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba against an American invasion. Fortunately, 2 things happened. 1, Kennedy never ordered an invasion. And 2, Khrushchev got argued out of this. But we have evidence that he considered it. The Russians have tactical nuclear weapons. People who have better information than I do will know if those weapons have been moved into territories occupied in Ukraine. Those weapons are usually on delivery vehicles that are dual use. In other words, they can be used for conventional forces as well as nuclear forces. I also don't believe the threat is high that the Russians would use nuclear weapons, but we don't know what could happen in an extreme situation. We learned after the Cuban Missile Crisis that submarine commanders had nuclear-tipped torpedoes, and one of them considered using one of them. So it's not clear that commanders in capitals can control battlefield use of nuclear weapons, even if they want to. So that's just something, it's a little scary to think about, but it's something to think about in the context of the war in Ukraine.
Just super briefly, since I know we're pretty much out of time, it's not going to be a blueprint for what's happening now, but if anybody's looking for a little bit more meat to dig into, I could strongly recommend reading The Long Telegram by George Kennan, where he talks about the sources of Soviet conduct, and he bases this on a reading of Russian history. And it's certainly, you know, that could also be a whole thing in and of itself, but he's a very thoughtful person. He's one of the leading Russianologists in the government at the time, and I think it's quite a thoughtful article that's definitely going to be food for thought, because he speaks about what came before the Soviet era, and now we're now dealing with what came after the Soviet era. So I think his analysis has still got some trenchance today.
Well, thank you both so much. I always hate to leave the talk of nuclear war, but on this topic or on this subject, I feel like it's relevant. But I cannot thank you both enough. So Tim, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. Andrew, as always, I love working with you. It's fun to sort of geek out on this topic. And as I meant, or as Mira mentioned at the beginning, anyone who is attending this program tonight will be entered to win one of Tim's books. And if you're like me, oh, you brought yours home, I didn't bring mine home. It is my holy grail. It's all written. But we also could not do this program without the support of the Pritzker Military Foundation as part of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library. They have been great partners with us. And the same goes with the John F. Kennedy Library and their education department for sort of working with me and getting some very cool documents for you guys to use. So thank you. Please stay in touch. We are always looking for new insights, ideas, reach out to us. And thank you again, and have a great night, everyone.
Thank
you, everyone.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Andrew.
Bye.
Thanks to all of you.